All right, everyone. Welcome to Grants and Sales Enablement for GovTech Startups. I'm super excited to have you all here. My name is Sedale Turbovsky. I am the CEO and co-founder of OpenGrants. And just as folks trickle in, there's just a few kind of housekeeping things, and then you'll be able to see some of this stuff in the chat today. So in this webinar format, for everyone's security, we do have things rather locked down. So please ask questions using the Q&A tool. Down below in the, well, depending on where it is on your screen, you should see an option to enable closed captioning. And that's the reason that also you see that the meeting is being live streamed. That's our closed captioning feature. So if you do wish to enable that feature, you can enable that and get closed captioning. Also, we'll be getting started in just a few minutes. Super excited to have Sarah here from CivStart. What we will be doing in the format for today's webinar is going to be, first, we're just going to get into kind of an interview, talk a bit about this concept, and then we will open up about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for kind of Q&A and a discussion based on that. So never fear, we will save some time to answer your questions, but do feel free to drop your questions in at any point while we're talking and having these discussions. So we are super excited to get to all of those today. And so if we do see kind of a critical mass of questions building up, we may cut our interview short and just get into all your specific questions. So please do feel free, drop those in. I'm going to kind of kick it off with a poll. Just want to kind of gauge everyone's energy and kind of vibe this morning, or afternoon, wherever you might be, maybe nighttime. So go ahead and respond to that. How are you feeling? How are you all doing today? Super excited to have you here. Please do kind of answer the poll, and I'm just going to introduce myself real quick again. My name is Sedale Turbovsky. I am the CEO and co-founder of OpenGrants, and OpenGrants is the easy way to win grant funding. And we are on a mission to deploy modern financial infrastructure to make grant funding transparent, equitable, and accessible. Super excited to have you all here today to learn more about grants and sales enablement, because right now there's this kind of unprecedented thing happening in the world. I think you all are aware. We've all experienced this pandemic, and on the heels of that, and as that continues, there is so much grant funding out there, and there's huge appetite from government to leverage that to really procure innovative solutions that you all might be providing. As a startup that sells to governments, this is something that's unlocked all kinds of really cool opportunities for us as a company. So I'm really excited to share kind of what I've learned about the space, both in my experience as a founder, as well as I spent about 7 years as a consultant in this space, helping other companies navigate this area, which is why I developed a passion in particular for grant funding. So I'm really excited and very stoked to have Sarah Nicole here. She is the co-founder and chief strategy officer at CivStart. And Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Hi, everyone. And thanks so much for having me on today with you, Sedale. So CivStart, we're a nonprofit, and we're really focused on helping governments be more innovative and serve their communities through partnering with startup solutions. So emerging technologies in the space, companies that are passionate about helping governments improve either their internal processes or how they interact with citizens, or how they just better their communities through those different products. And so the ways that we do that is we have an accelerator program. It's a 2-year-long program for GovTech and civic tech startups, where we try to help them navigate and succeed in the government space, focused on state and local governments. And then we also have some innovation programs for governments themselves, where we take governments through challenge-based pilot programs and oversee those success, trying to give governments more capacity to do these sorts of partnerships, de-risk startups for those governments, and also try to make it a more equitable space for those startups, be able to build those important relationships with government decision makers. And I think one area that I really don't know much about, but I believe could probably be very helpful to the startups in our accelerator program, are taking advantage of grants to more easily partner with governments and break down some barriers through those financial opportunities. And so, yeah, just excited to be here and really pick your brain, Sedale. I have a bunch of questions that I'd like to kind of interview you with today.
Awesome.
And kind of dive into that. So I think my first question really is, I know there are a lot of grant opportunities out there, but every company is different. Maybe they are run by an underrepresented founder, or they're focused on a really specific issue area. Maybe they're a nonprofit. I guess my big question is, how do you find the right grant opportunity for your company, and do those different types of factors play into that?
That's a great question. Before we dive deep into this space, I do want to quickly share the results of the poll, and just say super excited to see that a ton of you are excited to learn. If you're optimistic, deservedly so, probably skeptical about grants, and probably like many of us, definitely needing some midweek inspiration, and some of y'all are in the other category. Thank you all for showing up genuinely, and really excited to get into this. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that and just dive in a bit to the question here, which is, how do we find the right grant for our startup? So the place to start really is getting very specific about what you need and what the opportunity is. So and just to give some examples, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing our faces here. Just to give some examples, as a startup, you might be looking specifically to sell a transportation solution to government, or you might be looking to sell some kind of technology to government, like maybe radios, or maybe you have a better way to run their procurement system or accounting. And when you say kind of generally that you are doing accounting or you're working in transportation, it's going to be hard to find the right kind of grant. And this might sound really basic, but like the first step is getting really specific about the value you provide and how that is communicated within government. And so there's two things to break down. One is like getting your specific value. So if you are a transportation provider and you handle last mile solutions from like a bus stop to people's houses, and you do it autonomously, that's a really cool value proposition, and that's very specific. And then the next step is figuring out like how government talks about that, because the words they use and the language they use might be very different. And this is something that I think the team at CivStart can really help with. It's something your advisors can help with, because they are there's more work than you think going on between government and the private sector, trying to like just solve communication problems, like just like language. The very basics of like the things they say sound really different than the things you do, but they might be the same thing. And so there's an initial hurdle to overcome right there. And I think that's the first thing to figure out is how does the government talk about your solution? One of the easy ways to figure that out is actually to just reach out to them. They are there to help you, and they're the whole like idea of a civil servant, right? And it's right there in like that description of what they do. And so I think, Sarah, that like the first thing that you want to do is potentially, once you've figured out your value proposition, is get a meeting set up and say, hey, like, can we be helpful? How can we help? And then take that information back, and then you can start your search, because they'll probably list off a few things that maybe sound very specific. They'll probably use some really specific terminology as well. And then you can use that to go then search for grant funding and figure out, where there's maybe some good opportunities. The other thing to consider, of course, is that you want to look not only in terms of eligibility, you want to look not only eligibility for you, but eligibility for the government, and kind of flip that concept of you getting the money to the government is getting the money and you're going to be a subcontractor. So those are, to kind of summarize, one is get clear about your value proposition and very specific. Two is figure out the language that the government uses to describe your value proposition. And then three is to start that search and include in terms of eligibility not only small businesses or whatever kind of entity you are, but also government. Because as you look at what's available to government in terms of grant funding, this becomes a huge help to them because they don't necessarily even know what's available.
Right. And one question I had, it looks like someone else had it in the chat as well, is, how far along do you have to be in the development of your products? To be eligible for these grants, or maybe, and this is something I was thinking about too, maybe the grant could actually help you in the development of your products for a specific government partner, government need. What have you found is most common or most necessary?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, the answer is it sort of depends, right? So it depends on the program and the grant itself. So for example, the DoD has famously, AppWorks and DoD have their SBIR programs, which literally allow you and fund you to go and talk to end users of your product when you're just in like even the concept phase or prototype phase. And you get funding from the government to go spend a bunch of time interviewing and talking to end users of your product and getting a deep understanding of exactly what kind of needs they have. And then you effectively kind of work with them to co-develop the solution. And that's what that specific program is about. And there are SBIR programs at, I believe, 11 different agencies across the US federal government. So that's one example. And then there are kind of similar programs or matching programs at the state level. And you will not find them in kind of local government, but some state agencies also have matching programs like that. So sometimes it's like they want like concept, just ideas. On the other hand, there are plenty of grants that kind of require or ask for fairly mature products where they're looking to potentially demonstrate the product's effectiveness in a real world environment. And then there's other grant funding that is, specifically for like buying Nokia radios. Like maybe your job as a startup is like retailing radio systems to fire departments, right? That's, maybe that's your startup. Or maybe you're selling like, SaaS solutions to manage ambulance dispatch or some other kind of emergency services that the city is interested in buying. And, there's so many different grant programs out there, and it's really expansive. And unfortunately, there's not like a set rule of like, this is this way. But what you can be sure of is, if you go out there and start to explore the ecosystem, you definitely want to ask first and figure out, how they talk about your solution and what that kind of like government language is. And then you can start diving into kind of where you go. But I think the exciting takeaway maybe is that no matter where you are on the spectrum of like conceptual, like I wrote this down as an idea, to fully baked, there are typically grant funding programs for kind of that continuum of experience and maturity in terms of your technology. And so the government is an incredible innovation partner, but they do kind of require some navigation, and that's kind of the challenge frequently.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you found too, I know you talked a lot about the product itself and what issue it's focused on, and kind of finding the right language based on that. Are there also other grants for folks to consider that are based around the founder themselves? I know at CivStart, we are really intentional about working with a lot of underrepresented founders, a lot of women and minority in the space, just trying to make kind of the GovTech ecosystem a little bit more equitable. I think about 60% of the founders in our program are within those categories. Are there grants, specific to supporting certain types of founders, or do you find that it's mostly around kind of the issue that they're focused on?
This is a great question. We get it all the time where people will come in and they'll say, hey, I searched for like diverse founders, or I searched for founders who identify as X and I didn't find anything. And I always tell them, I was like, that's not how this gets talked about. And so there's two things I think that are really important here for folks to understand. And first and foremost is that, yes, there are a lot of set-asides, and there is a huge focus now on kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a lot of these programs. And say what you will, but a lot of the programs are doing a lot better. There's of course some, like the whole spectrum of experience still, but there's definitely some shining stars out there, and then there's some not so great programs that are, kind of getting dragged along. But there's definitely a movement. It's been very encouraging to see a lot more of a DEI lens applied to this space. However, where it gets confusing, I think, for founders and folks trying to navigate, is that is not what the government leads with in their communication. They'll lead with a specific solution, but they will have set aside kind of targets and other incentives that, as you look at the application, you'll find that, oh, this, there's some additional weight given if the founding team is from like a diverse background, or if it's a women-led business, then there's some additional weight given to the application itself, literally like weighting in terms of your points and score. Or another really interesting kind of lens that's applied frequently is, does this impact or generate an outcome for communities from backgrounds that are in like an economically disadvantaged area, or that, from diverse areas. And so those are aspects of grant applications. They're not typically what leads as the kind of purpose of the application. And so as you go through and search for grants, you'll find that frequently you want to focus in on that kind of value proposition, product, what have you. And then as you look at the application itself, you'll find ways to really take advantage of those opportunities based on your own kind of background and experience.
Yeah, that's really helpful clarity, actually, as you go on and try to search for those sorts of things. So we've talked a lot about maybe how to start off searching for the right grant for you, but is there more that you could share just around how to prepare your company in general to partner with the government or to be eligible for a grant, other things that folks should be keeping in mind?
Certainly. And let me zoom out first and circle back to also the idea of finding the right funding. So once you've done that kind of process of understanding your value proposition, how it's talked about, and kind of how to engage around that, the next thing you want to try to tackle is really what are the like expansive opportunities out there, because there's usually a lot, and you can kind of start to funnel those down. So you want to start, we talk about it as developing a fundraising strategy. You want to be really intentional about how you approach the market and the opportunities. And the reason for that is that you'll find that there's some opportunities, while they may be a really great fit, that are just massively competitive. And while it's always great to go compete and win, your chances of winning there are generally less. And so if you can find, for example, if you can find a really cool program with local government or at an agency that doesn't get as much attention as the DoD, you can often be much more competitive, receive funding, build those government relationships, and then you can go and use that case study to go tell that story to other agencies and then be more competitive in those subsequent applications. And so as a strategy, you definitely want to first kind of look at the universe of opportunities and then build a funnel the same way you would kind of look at sales, right? So you kind of build a funnel and look at, all right, well, what's most likely to convert, to use more of like a sales terminology, what's most likely to convert to actual funding and an actual relationship. And there's a variety of ways to kind of figure that out and suss it out. But the first thing you want to do is, once again, reach out. There's, I think frequently what I see is founders doing kind of like cold applications, basically cold calling for grants, right? So they'll just send in an application without having ever talked to the people at the program, talked to the people at the agency. They've made no like human connection there. And then they wonder why they don't get funded. And unfortunately, this space, like any other, we spend a lot of time in tech frequently and forget that like humans are a thing and human interaction is a thing. That needs to lead here as well. So, you want to reach out, have those discussions, and you can just ask them, how competitive is this process? And they'll usually not tell you exactly the answer, but they'll say, oh yeah, we receive 20,000 applications and we give out 6. The EDA just published something I think yesterday, where they said, hey, we got 560, I believe, applications for for some grant that they put out, and I think they were making like 12 awards, right? So that's really competitive. But there's other agencies that literally will award everyone who applies because they get so few applications that's just the reality. And so you definitely want to build that funnel, evaluate what's going to convert, what's most likely to convert, because you're going to spend time and energy on the application itself, and you don't want to have to do that and then, obviously not get the outcome that you're hoping for. So the way to kind of optimize that process is to build that funnel, dial in, those specific kind of what's most competitive and how are we going to be most competitive, and then lean into that, build those relationships. And then, like, all right, well, we're going to put in these 3 grant applications, and hopefully one of them or 2 of them or all of them get awarded. So that's kind of a deeper dive on that process. We have a great webinar about building funding strategies on our YouTube channel, so you can pop over there and check it out. And happy to include that in kind of follow-up email to this event. And then to jump forward, then, like, what are the other things you need to do to prepare to work with the government? This one, I mean, this is the reason that I love grant applications and this space in general, is because the government is an incredible financial opportunity for a startup. It can take you from 0 to like enterprise all at once. And they are incredibly sticky as customers. There's like no churn. They will keep paying you forever, and they cut really big checks. They spend a ton of money. And so just generally speaking, it's a very exciting space. And unfortunately, a lot of times companies just are either dissuaded actively by their investors from participating, or simply don't approach the space at all because it's so hard to navigate and difficult. But honestly, if you bite it off in little chunks and just work through the process, you can get there. I mean, the first thing you need to do, of course, is be a company. So make sure that you've filed your tax ID, and that you have an EIN, and that you are registered in whatever portals you need to get registered in. And this is probably like the first stumbling block where I've seen companies successfully be awarded a grant, and then they haven't completed their SAM registration, and so they don't get any funding. It's still it's paperwork, and it wouldn't have taken that long, but they didn't do it, and so it doesn't work out. The other situation, of course, that occurs in this space all the time is that you go to a government and you say, okay, well, we'd like to sell you the solution. We helped you get the grant funding. So they got the grant money. They're ready to pay you. And then they say, oh, our procurement process works this way. And then they list off like the most awful thing you've ever heard of. And then you're like, well, that's like 6 months. And by that time, they spend the money on something else, or they needed it. It was something mission critical, and you weren't ready to actually like pay the government. And so this is something like I think that a lot of entrepreneurs maybe aren't aware of. If you aren't, just figure it out like from the very beginning. It's the first question that we ask anytime we start building a relationship with a government agency is, hey, what's the procurement process? Or a little bit of a simpler way to ask them is, hey, what do we need to do to get paid by you? And they'll send you a list, like they're ready to go with that. And it varies from government to government. Unfortunately, there's almost zero standardization here. But typically it requires you sending in some paperwork and getting approved and potentially having insurance. And like there's a whole slew of requirements and processes out there in order to actually be able to sell to just the physical act of them writing you a check. There's a lot of paperwork involved in that. And I think that's a thing that people forget or don't understand properly. And it's a big stumbling block. And unfortunately, like as the world exists right now, there's not a lot of ways around it. Grant funding is kind of exciting because it does tend to like shortcut the process a little bit. But if the grant funding goes to the government agency, then once again, you're right back on that procurement track where yes, they're ready to partner with you. They want to spend that grant money on your company. And all of a sudden you are, 3 or 4 months away from delivering a solution. Well, at least from getting paid, because you can't like sign a contract and go through a procurement process. So figuring out like what the procurement process is and then getting in that door is key.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly a big barrier for governments in partnering with GovTech startups is just that they don't have the funding, not that they're unwilling to. So finding a grant like that could be huge for getting that initial partner. And then once you have a good case study like that, it's easier to kind of get in the door with other governments through regional referrals or just proof of concept. It sounds like, we've kind of talked about finding the right grant to apply to, the application process itself, and then once you get awarded a grant, the procurement process is a piece. But even I think the grant itself, right, kind of the timelines and the cash flows associated with grant allotments or agreements, especially for a startup, could be a little daunting when cash flow is really imperative to staying afloat. So can you talk a little bit more about that, things to keep in mind as far as the process of being awarded a grant or maybe even complying with grant reporting or anything like that in the cash flow piece?
Yeah, and this kind of goes to things to prepare for sure. You definitely want to have your accounting really dialed. Like books need to be super clean and clear, especially if you're going to get multiple grants, because at some point you're going to get audited, and if your accounting is off, that can be a really big problem for you in terms of doing future work with the government. So just take that note. And also, of course, the other thing is, if you have not retained legal counsel, do not sign a contract with the government without having an attorney who is retained by your company review it. So a couple of notes there. But at a high level standpoint, government does not pay. This is not like a SaaS agreement, right? Where you have someone sign up, they pay they pay their money and it goes into your account and it's right there and you get paid. So frequently government grants work on reimbursement, which means that you have to float the cash up front and do the work and deliver product, and then you get paid. And there are a lot of ways to navigate that. There's all kinds of different things out there, but you do need to be prepared for that, where you're waiting on potentially 90 days to get paid on significant capital outlay. So just as an example, at my first startup, Carbon Blue, we would submit invoices and we would get paid 65 days later, which meant that, or 45 days later, which meant that we had to float sometimes 200, 300K for a good amount of time. And as an early stage startup, that can be really difficult because you don't necessarily have $10 million sitting around. There are a variety of opportunities to work with basically folks who will do kind of cash forwarding or contract factoring. We have a few relationships and partners in that space. In fact, at OpenGrants, folks who will specifically look at your government contract, because ultimately your grant gets signed as a contract. You have this contract that you are like, okay, all right, so I got a contract. Government's going to reimburse me for $1 million for this demonstration project, but I have to go out and buy all this equipment and do all this stuff first. And then I get to send them invoices and they send us money. And that's how that process frequently works. So there are a variety of tools out there. Of course, cash flow management and just having a good CFO is a great way if you happen to have cash. If you don't have that money around, there are also frequently there are a lot of VCs and other folks who see getting a grant as a good signal. So you potentially can raise money, but you can also work with people who will effectively charge you a small fee or sometimes a large fee, but they will then forward you the cash that you need to sustain your operation. Because then this is one of the big benefits of working with government is every lender in the world knows that the US government or governments in general are going to pay their bills. If there's a contract and there's a bill, they're going to pay it. They might not pay it quickly, but they will do it. They will get it done eventually. And so it's a great, in terms of collateral, it's pretty solid. And you'll find a lot of lenders that are willing to work with you on those in those kinds of situations because you have the contract and they know the government's going to pay you eventually.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful to know. I guess skipping back a step, it's hard enough to find a grant that you think is a right fit for you. But sometimes the application process itself is extremely daunting and time consuming. Do you have any, I guess, advice or tips for the actual application process? And is there a way to kind of utilize resources for future grant applications, things that people should be saving, keeping in mind as they apply to things and put a lot of work into that?
Yeah, I will mention first the nice workaround, which is that maybe if you're selling to government, you can get really good at finding grants that the government can use to buy your tech or your service, which means that you will never ever have to put in a grant application because they will do it for you. And that is sort of the ideal, right? Like that's the super kind of like, it's not a shortcut, but it's definitely a pretty sweet way to work. And there's a lot of good programs out there that governments have access to that you simply, as companies that are private, do not. So that's one opportunity. Of course, if you are getting a grant for yourself, there's typically some kind of application process. And my kind of first note on this is just go talk. You don't even have to hire them necessarily, but go talk to a consultant who knows the program really well. There's a huge network of kind of a cottage industry of consultants that are available out there, and they will have a conversation with you for free just to tell you like what this application entails and what it's all about. And you, as a founder, can then make a decision whether or not you want to work with them. And honestly, like this is something that I know that as founders, and myself as a founder, it's something I think we all struggle with, but frequently it makes a lot more sense to just hire the consultant, pay them some money so that you don't have to do this, because it is a lot to learn. There's a steep learning curve. If you haven't done a ton of them or you haven't done a lot, it's very daunting and can be quite problematic for you. So that's my suggestion. But if you think, if you find yourself, you think you're just an expert communicator, expert writer, and you know the space, and maybe you were in academia or maybe you were at an agency before, and you can do it, then it's just attention to detail and follow the rules, and you'll be able to put in an application. But honestly, in summation, I'd say the ideal is find grant funding that the government can use to pay for your product. And the reason I bring that up, and the reason that this is like a really great way to approach the market, is that as I mentioned earlier, there are more opportunities for funding than there ever have been in the United States for government to buy stuff right now. And it's so massive, in fact, in terms of the amount of money, that the government itself doesn't know what's going on, and they're overworked. They don't have the tools. They're not in a good spot really to be super informed. So if you can go to an agency or a government and say, look, we have this service that's really great, and we know that you have this need, and you can bring a grant to the table and say, look, you can pay for it with this, or you can cover 90% of your costs with this. All of a sudden, you go from having a pretty solid sales pitch to what will probably amount to a slam dunk, and it will really probably convert into a sale at that point. And so if you can pull that off, that's really the way to go. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, my personal thought here is this is one of those things that just makes sense to hire a consultant, because they know the agencies, they often have relationships with the agency and the people doing the award, so that they can get you some real insight about what those folks are looking for. And they have a real streamlined process for addressing the opportunity. And so they're just going to deliver a better outcome than you can. And the statistics prove it out. You're about 3 times more likely to be successful if you work with a professional grant writer who has experience, rather than just doing it on your own. And to go further, the firm I worked at, we had a 99.9% success rate applying for funding. And that's based on 2 important things. One is we had those relationships and that experience, and 2, we knew when to say no. And that's the big value you'll get out of the consultants as well, is they can really quickly help you say, oh, this is not a good fit. This is not a good project. Let's not move forward, because they understand another level of what's being driven at those agencies, that unless you, like I said, unless you have the experience, you probably just don't have your head wrapped around fully what's happening.
Right. Yeah, that's an impressive success rate that you all had. So I guess that's a unique benefit, right, of being a GovTech startup is you are selling to government, and therefore sometimes the government will apply for the grant for you. We've even had governments approach CivStart before wanting to apply for grants that we would assist with, or our startups would assist with, and that's always something we're happy to do. But if you don't have the ability to hire a consultant, say, to go out and build those relationships with the agencies or know the right people at those agencies in order to have that type of a scenario occur, what advice do you have any other thoughts or ways folks maybe could develop relationships with those civil servants that you would recommend?
Yeah, so there's a few things I'll throw out there. One is that across the United States, there exists a network of consultants who are paid for by the federal government specifically to help you sell to government. And these are called the Procurement Technical Assistance Centers. And if you search for United States Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, you can find these places. They offer free services, and you can get really great one-on-one help from consultants who can help you navigate this stuff. They do not help you navigate grants in general. They will only help you apply for and navigate SBIR, but they will help you navigate government relationships. So there's that. If you have no money to hire a consultant, that's one resource. The SBDCs are also another great, heavily underutilized resource that's provided for free to you as taxpayers. So those are some thoughts. My other suggestion is simply to go meet folks. If you have the time and bandwidth to do that, that's the best way, of course. When we were building OpenGrants, I literally spent all of 2019 just getting meetings with people at state agencies and sitting down with them and showing them my little Figma drawing of what we were doing with OpenGrants. And it's been massively useful moving forward. And we've built incredible relationships, and we have great relationships at state, local, and federal government levels because we put in the time to do a ton of customer discovery. Not everyone has that luxury. I totally understand, but we did, and we took the opportunity to just go, and myself personally took the opportunity to go and build those relationships. And that's, part of it is just being genuine and showing up. And we've found that there are so many civil servants who are trying to do so many good things, and they simply don't have the resources and the time to tackle all the things. And so they're super happy to take a meeting with you, especially if you come in with basically the line of how can we help you? It's a really different space. I think the paradigm shift that you should have as a founder is, typically if you go into if you come to OpenGrants and pitch us a product, we're on the defensive. We don't want to spend money, and we generally are trying not to bring on more solutions. We're we've got enough, trying to keep our overhead down. That's our mindset, and that's the mindset of companies when you go to pitch them. Government, on the other hand, is they're looking to spend money and looking for solutions. They're ready to spend a bunch of money on you. And I think that the minute you start to realize that and you come in and say, hey, this isn't and the cool thing is they're divorced from the money too. It's they want to spend the money, and it's not their money, and it's not their company's money, it's the government's money, so it's whatever. And there's a whole different discussion to have about that. But they're ready to spend money on you. And so if you come in and say, hey, how can we help? Honestly, with government, the discussion is almost never about how much the thing costs. It's about, are you going to deliver a value to us? And are you going to solve our problem? Are you solving our problem? If you're solving our problem, we're just going to give you money. We will spend all of the money if you will solve our problem. And so if you go and set up a meeting and really your lead in is, how can we help? And you want to obviously make that really specific, but that concept, I mean, I've had incredible meetings with everyone from the CIO of the state of California down to, the people at the DMV, across the board. If you can come in and say, hey, how can you help? And you start to get very specific, and maybe some of the problems they're actively trying to solve, and you include that in your intro, they will take meetings with you. And sometimes they kind of have to take meetings with you, but they'll take meetings with you, and it will be really productive. And so I just highly suggest that kind of paradigm shift for you as founders, in particular, for people as founders who are trying to sell a government. Go build the relationships yourself if you have the time. And then, ideally, as you scale or look to scale, then you bring on people do that or who have those relationships. But it's very much still a relationships-driven space. It's definitely not like they're not super inclined to just like buy something out of a marketplace. Even, you know, the marketplaces that do exist are really there to like solve procurement, which is something we talked about earlier. They're not there to like drive marketplace efficiencies, so to speak, like Amazon. They're there to solve procurement. You still have to build that relationship. So unfortunately there's no other suggestions that I have on how to hack that other than like go do it yourself or hire somebody.
Oh yeah, I mean that's definitely kind of what we preach at SIFSTART. It's a very relationship focused industry, and you can't just create a product, start pitching it, and expect people to want to buy it. You have to really understand their unique needs first and kind of create your product around that. And the governments, you know, really want to feel like you have a very deep understanding of their challenge before you even start talking about how you can help. And so that's really why we've started utilizing those challenge-based procurement methods in our government programs. And it's been pretty successful. So I definitely agree with you. And I think we, Sedale, got to hang out at an ICMA conference. I think those big, you know, government association events are a great thing to spend some of your marketing dollars on, to get in the door and just mingle with those folks, listen to what they're saying on those panel discussions, and you know, get involved as a thought leader before, you know, a seller to them. So
I do want to add, you know, your challenge-based approach to like solving issues and procurement is very interesting, because I think for me it's always lived as sort of a evolution of a very common tool that a lot of governments use, which is the RFI process. So there's a lot of agencies, and this kind of speaks to maybe how you start to build those relationships in a more scalable way early on, at least, and do your prospecting. Is governments across the board in the United States specifically, but also in the EU and some other places, will use what is called a request for information. And this is when they're at like early stages of trying to solve a problem or build a program. And they'll reach out to industry to ask about X. They say, you know, what's happening in VR, as an example, for virtual meetings. Maybe that's what they ask about. You as a founder, like, people are always surprised. They're like, all right, well, how did this company get this big contract? And it's because they showed up early. Like, they showed up at that RFI process, and they submitted like some very concise and very tailored to their product documents about what the industry looks like. And unfortunately, as in their role as civil servants, they don't necessarily have the luxury of going out and like talking to a bunch of people in the industry. They don't have the luxury or budget necessarily to, and definitely don't have the time to like hire McKinsey or Deloitte to tell them about how an industry is developing. So they use this RFI process. And the thing about the RFI process is that will start to shape their view of the industry and tech and all of the solutions. And that's their viewpoint. And so if 4 companies show up and give them their information, that's going to be how they understand the space. And so it's very similar. Like, if you told, if you spoke to your kid in Klingon, they would just grow up speaking Klingon, right? Like, that's what's going to happen. And so if you want your product and your tech and your company service, what have you, in front of the government, get engaged early. And this goes back to just like build a genuine relationship, like figure out who's talking about what you're doing and who's interested, and start building that relationship, provide them value really early, so that they start to understand the space from your viewpoint, or from like a diverse array of viewpoints ideally, but from a business standpoint, maybe it's just your viewpoint, and that's fine, because ultimately they will end up purchasing your solution, if that's like the reality that they are being presented.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we only have about 15 minutes left, so I didn't want to hog all of the questions, and see maybe if we want to turn to any of the audience questions.
Yeah, let's get into it. And I'm going to go ahead and as I'm kind of looking through these questions, I'm going to launch another poll. I would love to hear from the audience just kind of what your challenges are right now in terms of fundraising and looking for grants in general. Let me know where you're at in your process. and then I'm going to just kind of scroll through these questions here, and we will get into it. So and feel free to, as we're rolling through these questions, feel free to add more. But I'm just going to start at the top here as the poll goes on, and I'll tackle this first question. Says grants.gov SAM are more insane to navigate. How do you actually get access to bidding offers if the government makes it impossible to even begin applying? This is a great question. Unfortunately, and I'll go ahead and answer it here. The procurement process is the procurement process, and CivStar's doing some really cool things to innovate around that with their challenge approach. And government is they're trying to make things easier, but it takes time. One of the things I will suggest here is that if you really want to get into the government space, there are a variety of ways to really start to learn how to flex those muscles properly and get really good at it. CivStart offers an amazing program. If you're not a part of that yet, you might consider looking at what they have going on. There's also a variety of resources out there to help you navigate this space. Many consultants. You can find them on OpenGrants. You can find them just generally on the internet if you kind of search around. But yeah, it's a real challenge, and the government is acutely aware of how bad it is. It's the reason we built OpenGrants. It's the reason programs like CivStart exist. Honestly, there's a huge opportunity for whoever kind of really solves this properly. But the reality is, if you want to work with them, you got to learn to navigate that stuff. And then Sarah, I don't know if you have additional thoughts you'd like to offer on that one, but that's kind of my 2 cents at least.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think you're not gonna get rich fast in this industry. It takes a lot of patience and kind of learning the culture and building those relationships. So I totally agree with you.
Awesome, very cool. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll as we dive into some of the rest of these questions. Thank you all for responding. Finding the right grant opportunity, that's the one. I'll just say, selfishly, but I think what we've constructed at OpenGrants is pretty awesome. And if you take the time to sign up for free, I think we could probably find you the right grant opportunities. So please do check it out and let us know how we can make it better. The other thing that I'll throw out there is honestly, talk to your advisors, people within your network, if you are lucky enough to have one. If you don't have a network, reach out to things like the PTACs, the Procurement Technical Assistance Centers, work with resources like CivStart, and get out there and start to network. And just through your network and experience, you can also really start to dial that in. I see another big challenge out there for folks is building government relationships. Once again, I think some of these things, unfortunately, the reason they're challenging is because there's not a short way to do it, right? Like you got to put in the time and effort and energy, or you got to have the capital to go out and build those. I am happy personally to be a resource there. And I know CivStart does some awesome stuff in that space as well. So reach out, get connected to folks who can help you start to get connected. And then, also one thing I do want to bring up that Sarah mentioned as well is that there are those, there's industry events in government in particular. They're hugely beneficial. I know that many of us, anyone who spent a lot of time in tech or any other space, has probably gotten quite a bit jaded on industry trade shows. But this is one space where they are massively effective because you have all of these decision makers and folks that you need to network with in one space. And it can be hugely beneficial. So something to look at, especially as live events come back, that can be a real benefit to you. All right, back into the questions here. Have you found the shotgun spray and pray method of applying to grants is helpful, or the super focused method is more effective? Super focused all the way. Get a good funnel, dial in exactly what's going to convert, and then go forth and conquer. Because if you do it the other way, you're just going to find that you lose a lot and that you don't get a lot of benefit out of it. So definitely get super focused, understand the value proposition, and lean into those opportunities, because frequently it's not just following the rules, finding the right opportunity, but it's that last thing that I kind of alluded to, which is build the relationship. If they know that you're a high quality person, high quality company, that you're providing them value early, they're going to be very interested. A great question from Dustin. Any references to the pros and cons of other transaction OT consortia? I do not have a really great understanding of exactly how these are better or worse than grant funding. And Sarah, I don't know if you do either, but Dustin, if Sarah doesn't and I don't, I'm happy to find one of our experts and we'll get some content out. But Sarah, any thoughts?
No, I'm kind of in the same boat as you, so I will have to follow up on that one.
All right. Well, Dustin, we will do some digging. We'll ask our expert marketplace about this, and we'll get some content out to you. Just kind of running down, the OT consortia setup, and hopefully we'll get that out very soon. I see a question that says, "How does that work?" From Tori Banks. Maybe Tori, you could just drop into the QA and put some additional context, because I assume you were asking that while we were talking about something specific. So if you could just drop in there, Tori, and put that additional context, I'm happy to answer that. Jed, I am new to grants funding. What could be a starting point to search grants, which are competitive and less competitive? From my standpoint, of course, OpenGrants is a great place to start. Obviously, that is also my company. There's a lot of there's other places you can go look. Google is really great. Grants.gov is great. BetaSam, I'm not going to say great. Honestly, BetaSam is really awful, but it's another place you can go look for grant funding. The government they do their best at making sure all these opportunities are available to you. And OpenGrants is free, by the way, for you to just generally go in and start searching for grants. So highly suggest it. We made it accessible for a reason, and that is because this information should be accessible to you anyways. And in some cases, the government has kind of dropped the ball. But in other cases, they've done a really great job. So there's a lot of places to look. Google is a place to start. I don't know, Sarah, if you have some thoughts on other resources, but those are my suggestions.
Yeah, no, we're actually really excited to be partnering with your company, Sedale, so that our startups can utilize that to find the grants, because I think, going to the main government sites and trying to search it is just really difficult. So yeah, we're excited to hopefully have more of our startups sign up for free and utilize your products.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll just add here that to answer the competitive question, once again, this is one of those things that it varies. It depends on what's competitive and what's less competitive. And it can also vary year to year, depending on kind of what people are looking at and how successful or unsuccessful a program was. The best way to answer this question from my standpoint is to say, a great place to start with looking for grants is, OpenGrants. You want to also start by defining your value proposition, understanding what people are looking for in the space. And then to get an answer about what's competitive and not competitive, reach out. Anytime you get a grant opportunity in front of you, there'll be some contact information. Reach out to those people and ask them how many applications they get and how many awards they plan on awarding, and then you'll know. But unfortunately, there's no all of these are competitive and all of these are not competitive. There's some general ones I can say. For example, SBIR through the NSF is very competitive because everyone knows about it. DoD SBIR also very competitive because everyone talks about it all the time. USDA's SBIR, not very competitive. No one knows they have one. So there you go. But to go through all of the programs would take hours and hours. So the best way is to reach out and get that understanding. Question about, as a grant writer, how do you find companies that want grant writing for government funding? One way to do that is to create a profile on OpenGrants and then say that you want to work with companies that want government funding, and then they will reach out to you. That's one way to do it. There's a lot of other ways to find leads and opportunities to work, marketplaces and such. So that's I'll just leave it at that. Can you talk about contacting people in procurement connections? Let me take a stab at, I think what you're asking about is, how do you sort of start to understand what the procurement process is for any given government. Sarah, I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on kind of how you approach this, because you do some really innovative things here. But generally speaking, these people have titles like procurement officer or head of procurement, and they're listed on a public, on a public data set somewhere, and you just dig up their info and reach out to them.
Yeah, I would say, unfortunately, if you know one government, you know one government. So, each procurement process is kind of unique. There are procurement officials, like Sedale said, that you can reach out to gain more insight. And then, if you're working with a particular government agency on a project, they can illuminate that for you as well. So, different governments have different thresholds for what needs to go through procurement. A lot of times we do at-cost pilot programs or first-year contracts that fall within a discretionary budget, so that we don't even have to go through that procurement process. So, so asking what that is might be helpful as well.
Yeah, great insights. I love that. Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a lot of other kind of streamlined ways to do this. Shy of hiring consultants to do it for you. We listened to a grant writing service that wanted to champion our tech for 48K, promised at least 50K in funding for that time frame. Sounded like mainly the AFWorks program and SPIR opportunities. It sounded like a high figure, and it's basically a wash, but is that within the ballpark? That sounds very high. Also sounds like a little bit suspect because they were going to spend so much time. Anyways, that sounds like a bad deal, and I would not have worked with them. But yeah, I mean, typically for SBIR, we see people charging anywhere from like 8 to 25K to go after 100 to 250K in funding. So that seems like a really high number, and I'll just leave it at that. We got 2 minutes left, so I'll try to go through as fast as possible here. Do you have experience, preference for DFI entities working on climate funding in Africa? I see DFC, USAID, and Power Africa in that space. We don't have experience, but our consultants do. So definitely reach out on the OpenGrants platform and talk to some folks. Just search for USAID and you'll find in our talent marketplace, and you'll find those folks. Pivot is a great grant search database. Yes, it is. Pivot's awesome, used by lots of universities. If you have a relationship with a university, definitely look at Pivot. It does tend to focus on research, and like it's a great university product. But yeah, it is a great grant search database. We love Pivot. And do you guys write up paperwork or proposals needed for these grants that we can hire? Yep. Experts in our marketplace, who are these consultants I've referenced, really do that. So yes, we do. I'm going to go ahead and just close us out here. Sarah, thank you so much for joining and for spending time with me today. Really appreciate it. Do you want to share any kind of last thoughts on CivStart and what y'all are working on with everybody?
Yeah, sure. So, if you are a tech company that has a good solution for state and local governments, we are actually launching our application for our next cohort program in about a month or so, and you can find that on our website. I'd love to learn more about what your company is doing and see if we can support your work through that program. So that's probably the most timely thing. And again, really love the work that OpenGrants is doing, and we're excited to be partnering with them. Definitely encourage all of the startups in our program to take advantage of the free data that's on their platform. So thanks for having me. This was really fun, and I learned a lot. So
awesome.
Enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, I hope this was useful for everybody. This recording will be available. And then we would love, check out OpenGrants, check out CivStart. Feel free to reach out to us. And we'll be sending along some resources and other information that's follow up to today's event. So thank you all for coming, and we will see you all around.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.